Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Barnes, and on behalf of Campbell Company, I would like to welcome you to California Major Giving Trends, Challenges, Opportunities, and Recommendations. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly go through some logistics for those of you who may be new to our webinars. First, close any programs other than GoToWebinars, of course. Call in using a telephone instead of using your computer speakers. Move your cell phone away from your computer, and if you experience any visual issues, you can contact 1-800-263-6317. Today's webinar will last 60 minutes, and you'll earn 1 continuing education credit that is good for your participation with CFRE International. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive an email from GoToWebinar that includes information on how to download your certificate. We won't be sharing slides from today's presentation, but we will be sending a link to the recording in the follow-up email from GoToWebinar. We do welcome questions throughout the session, and you can use the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel that should be on the right side of your computer screen. We'll also hold time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. Now I'd like to turn it over to Cassie Carter, a senior consultant in our fundraising division, and Dan Nieves, our senior consultant from our executive search group at Campbell Company.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We appreciate that. My name is Cassie Carter, and I'm a senior consultant with Campbell Company. And I'm very excited to be talking with all of you today about major gifts, one of our absolute favorite subjects. My background is in science education and nonprofit management. I have been working with higher ed and arts and culture organizations for more than 30 years doing fundraising and program development. Dan.
Hi, this is Dan Nieves, and I want to first of all welcome you all to joining this webinar. I'm pleased to have been with Campbell Company for 8 years, but I bring 25 years of professional experience overall in higher education, cultural institutions, and nonprofit executive search. I've had 15 years in nonprofit executive search, where I've served as trusted advisor to national and regional nonprofits to help them identify top talent. A lot of my specialty work has always been towards philanthropy in my time that I've been working with Campbell Company. So I've literally had thousands and thousands of conversations with fundraising leaders involved in major giving. My client base is mostly in California in the Western United States, but I also have worked in Chicago and in Washington, D.C. early in my career.
So joining us today is Chris Carter, the Director of Development and Communications with the Livermore Valley Performing Arts Center, and Laura Mayer, the Director of Advancement and External Affairs from the Center for Early Education. And I'll have both Chris and Laura just give us a little bit more detail into their background. So why don't we start with Chris?
Hi, everybody. So my name's Chris Carter, and I work in Livermore, California, in the Bay Area for a performing arts center, and I'm the development director there. We have a pretty small shop, and we do pretty much everything that is required to raise money for our organization. We're a nonprofit center, and we've been around for about 10 years, so it's relatively new. And so major giving is very important for us. It's a really critical element to what we do.
Great, well, welcome. Sorry, go for it, Laura.
That's great. I'm Laura Marr. I'm with the Center for Early Education. We are located in sunny Los Angeles, California, and I have been in the advancement development world for just over 20 years, specifically at the center for almost 5 years. We are running a $75 million campaign right now for new buildings and working extensively managing our staff of 5, but specifically 1 person towards major gifts, and really kind of developing our stewardship and cultivation and solicitation practices. So it's very exciting, and I've also worked across the country at different secondary and primary independent schools and doing the same type of work. So I'm excited to share what I can with you today.
Thank you so much, Laura. We appreciate you and Chris joining us.
So we're going to spend our day today, first of all, our time together to give a kind of a brief overview of the Giving USA data so we can talk about some of the national philanthropy trends. These are important when we're thinking about what is actually out there for individual giving and major gifts. And then we're going to discuss some key findings of our survey and interviews with leaders in both Northern and California, including our specific research work on major giving. Highlight some key takeaways, and then we're going to wrap up with time for our panelists, both Chris and Laura, and then open up for questions from our audience. So let's get started. So this first slide shows information from the Giving USA Foundation, which released its philanthropic data for 2017. So this data was researched by the Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And this slide shows that giving has topped the $400 billion mark in 2017 for the first time, now at $410 billion. And this was an $18 billion increase from the previous year in 2016. The largest slice of the pie, as you can see here, is giving to individuals, which comprised 70% of total giving in 2017, followed by foundations, which includes grants made by independent, community, and operating foundations, and family foundations as well, which amounted to 16% of all giving. Bequests accounted for 9% of all gifts in 2017, and corporations comprised 5% of total giving in 2017. If you look at the slide and we think about total individual giving, we have to not think about just the 70%, but also part of the foundations, which significant part of it is family foundations, and the bequests as well. And when we think about that, 86% of total giving of that $410 billion is really coming through individuals. I think that's very important for us when we think about major gifts. Okay, and this slide is a lot of data on this slide, so bear with us here. There's giving that is actually showed over percentages over 5-year span, starting in 1978, all the way up to the 5-year span of 2013 to 2017. Giving by individuals has declined, as you can see, as a percentage of total giving over the last 40 years, from 83% in the first 5-year period of 1978 to 71% at the last period beginning in 2013. Even though overall philanthropy has increased by $18 billion, individuals are not as giving as much. However, as you can see on the next part for foundations, excuse me, can you go back to the next slide? As you can see in the previous section, that giving of foundations has continued to grow over the past 40 years, from 5% in the first 5-year period to 16% in the last 5-year period. And this is probably where you're seeing the drop-off of individual giving, is possibly falling into many of the family foundations which have grown over that time are showing part of that decrease. Giving by bequests is captured between 7 to 9% of total giving, and giving by corporations remains steady, pretty much at 5%. Next slide. Great. This slide here shows where all that $410 billion by type of recipient, where is it all coming from? And religious organizations continue to receive the largest share of charitable dollars in 2017 at 31% of total, and it's still declining over the last 2 decades. Education subsector received the second largest share of charitable dollars in 2017 at 14% of the total. Human services was at 12%. Gifts to grant-making foundations was 11% of the total. The health subsector was at 9%. Public society benefit organizations received 7%, and international affairs was at 6%. Arts, culture, and humanities was at 5%, and the environmental subsector was at 3%. Just want you to note that all these areas of recipients showed increases across the board, except for international affairs, which actually dropped by 9%. So we're doing a statewide study, and I know that we have people from all over the state listening in, but this actually was a kind of a staggering number that what was received by the UCLA School of Public Affairs and their generosity gap that was dated in 2014. It showed a huge impact on philanthropy overall and major giving in Southern California. And just so you know, this was really the motivation for our research and study on major gifts that you're going to be able to see, because we really wanted to understand what the current snapshot was, not only for major giving in California, but see if there's been any recovery since this. LA residents gave $1 billion less to local nonprofits post-recession, and that wasn't what we were seeing also in Northern California, where giving continued to trend upward. And then a startling number is that gifts at the $1 million and above had a significant dip. And this demonstrated that strategic gifts pretty much overall was impacted by this loss. And, you know, in California, 2/3 of total charitable giving comes from wealthy households, from households at the $200,000 in annual income. So this was an important consideration when we launched into this study. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Cassie, who's going to start sharing a little bit more about our research.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for that introduction and overview. So now let's spend a little bit of time taking a deeper look at major gift fundraising in California and think about some of that data that Dan was sharing with us just now. So one of the things, as he mentioned, that really intrigued us was that, especially in Los Angeles, that post-recession recovery seemed to be really slow. And we wanted to understand, was that still the case, or are California nonprofits starting to rebound from the recession? So we launched a focused program this spring with an online survey. We received responses from 65 California-based nonprofits. And then we did a sampling of organizations looking at small shops and large shops. We did some in-depth interviews with development leaders. Chris and Laura were two of the people that we spoke with. And then we took all this data and information that we had and we compared it to the Giving USA data and to the post-recession data to give us an understanding, a greater understanding of what's going on in California around major gifts. And what we'll see as we go through this data is that some of what we found is just scratching the surface and asking us a lot more questions than what we really prompting more questions than what we'd already asked. So if we take a look at who participated in the survey, we had a good representation across the subsectors of nonprofits, with the majority coming from arts and culture, independent schools, and human services. We also took a look at different size organizations that had less than 10 million in annual revenues based on 2016 data, and then organizations that were quite large, over 50 million in annual revenues. And this is all revenue, not just philanthropic revenue. And then the interviews that we conducted represented both large and small organizations and also different subsectors within the nonprofit world of California. We had more respondents from Southern California at 57%, good representation from the Bay Area, but we also saw nonprofits from across the state responding to the survey. But you'll see that the responses were a little heavier weighted to Southern California. At a high-level overview of the trends that we saw and the data we collected, there's really some good news in here. And what we were finding is that organizations that raised over $2.5 million in major gifts increased by almost 23% in 2017 from the 2015 data that we looked at before with the post-recession. We also saw that 2/3 of the nonprofits that we surveyed have received at least one major gift of more than $1 million in the past 3 years, and that 70% of the nonprofits surveyed had received a $1 million gift or larger, which was up from the 64% in 2015. So what we're starting to see now in 2016, 2017, is a bit of a rebound, a bit of an increase in major gifts finally. So this is the good news. And if we take a look at the number and the dollar amounts of major gifts that were raised, what we found is at those upper levels, especially if you take a look at gifts coming in between $2.5 million and to $5 million level and over $10 million, what we saw is an increase in those gifts at the larger organizations especially. So this is really good news. What this is telling us is that those wealthy households that Dan was referring to are starting to invest in nonprofits again and at a significant level. When you take a look at the gifts under $1 million, we did see a decrease, but when you total all the dollars across, what you're finding is that people are making larger gifts to organizations. So even though the $1 million gifts, the ones coming under $1 million were less, it adds up overall, which is really, again, good news. So now I'm going to hand it back to Dan to talk about the factors that we saw influencing the success of major gifts.
Thanks, Cassie. And that's really exciting news just to even hear that, so that many of our listeners are probably thinking about starting their own major gift program or actually trying to revamp or restructure or re-engineer that program. So I think that the good news is that please do, because major gifts are increasing. Focus on major gifts that make an impact. What we found was having at least one full-time major gift fundraiser increased the number of $10,000 or more gifts received by 54.5%. That's a very strong number just for one full-time major gift fundraiser. All organizations that had more than 5 full-time major gift fundraisers received at least 25 major gifts in 2017, and 57% of these organizations received more than, sorry about that. Sorry about that.
Did we lose you, Dan?
Yeah, just a minute. And 89% of organizations that received 4 or more gifts for at least $1 million or more, 3 years have had at least 2 full-time major gift fundraisers. 98% of them have had 1 full-time major gift fundraiser. So the investment in a full-time major gift officer has strong return on investment. And this slide has a lot of information. I appreciate that. But what I want you to see is that with major gifts impact and the staff investment, when you're a single director of development without any major gift officers and you're trying to raise major gifts, there's a certain threshold that you can only raise to, which is up to less than 100 donors, or probably even less. But if you add one major gift officer to the mix, you can significantly increase the percentages of the numbers of prospects and donors to actually raise more money. And you can see that 2 to 4 major gift officers and 5 major gift officers, that added value of increasing it by 55% actually will be exponential over time. That if you, and this creates problems if you think that you're going to be able to raise 250 or more major gifts with just by yourself or without a full-time major gift fundraiser. So I think these numbers are important to consider.
Okay, so if we take a look now, even take a deeper dive behind the data that Dan was just discussing, and we think about how we actually manage those prospects, taking the very good point that the more people that you have interacting directly with your donors, the more likely you are to be closing major gifts. We saw that trends show, if you take a look at portfolio structure, that a third of the prospects in a typical portfolio will be in the solicitation phase at any given time. So that means that you've got 2/3 of your prospects that you are either cultivating or you are taking them through the identification and qualification steps so that they are not yet ready to solicit. So that means that if you have 100 people in your portfolio, you're not going to necessarily be having the potential to close 100 gifts in that given year. The other thing when you think about workload and you think about structure of portfolios is all of your prospects need to be part of a stewardship program, and the distribution and size of your portfolio needs to take that into account along with how you're structuring your staff in terms of who is managing this stewardship. And then if we think about organizations that have fewer than 100 major donors under management, so this is fewer than 100 people that have somebody who is focused on that person as potentially a major donor, you have a 10% chance that you will receive more than 50 gifts of the major gift level of 10,000 or more. And so then if you take a look at the bullet below and you think about a single full-time frontline major gift officer, that increases your likelihood of closing those gifts to 20%. So a couple ways to think about this data. If you assume when you don't have a full-time fundraiser that you will close 10% of those 50 gifts that you potentially could be receiving, then that would be 5 gifts at 10,000 or more. When you bring in a full-time fundraiser, you're going to double that to at least 10 gifts of 10,000 or more, which increases your chance of success. And I do want to emphasize here that concept of that full-time frontline major gift officer. When we talk with our panelists, one of the things that we'll explore a little bit more is what else is on fundraisers' plates and how many of us actually have the opportunity to have somebody who's focused entirely on major gifts and out the door. That's part of the trick and the secret sauce to successful major gift fundraising. So if we take a look at the ideal number of prospects to have under management, sort of the tongue-in-cheek answer is as many as possible, because that's where if they're under management and they're being interacted with and you're cultivating them, that's where you're likely to see those gifts coming in. But it's important to note that you need to have as many as you can manage. So while when we surveyed, 49% of the organizations we surveyed had less than 100 major gift prospects under management in portfolios. So that means that almost the majority or half of the nonprofits out there do not have very many people in their pipeline. And if you take a look at that pipeline of your annual donors, you're identifying the ones that have potential to become a major gift prospect. You're hopefully maybe moving them up into that mid-level donor section where they're giving more than just a transactional gift. And then hopefully over time they will become a major gift prospect. You need to have a lot of people in that pipeline and you need to be interacting with them. I do want to caution us, though, poorly managed prospects are almost worse than not managing them. If you're doing outreach to your prospects that is inconsistent without follow-up, then that's where you are almost at more risk of losing that potential major donor than if you don't have them in a portfolio to begin with. The one thing that we do want to note is when we look at industry standards and we think about what we hear as sort of the typical portfolio size of 100 to 200 prospects for a full-time frontline fundraiser, and I'll keep emphasizing that piece of it. What we found is that most of the organizations or many of the organizations that we interviewed and that we surveyed don't follow that structure. There's a lot of other sizes of portfolios and a lot of other things that determine who's working with the donors and how many donors they're working with. The other piece that's important that we found through the work that we did is that the use of data and metrics, when you apply that to major gifts, it actually increases your success quite a bit. It's that concept of being deliberate, strategic, and process-driven. One of the challenges I think that we've all faced when we've been working on major gifts is this giant list of names and not knowing where to start and not knowing how to prioritize. And so when we talked with and took quotes from people who are working successfully in major gifts, what we found is that focus on metrics, database, prioritizing your list, prioritizing your work plan is really one of the important reasons that they were seeing more success in building the relationships. Major gift fundraising really sits at that intersection between your data and your strategy and the time to build deep and authentic relationships. And then when we looked at some of the shared qualities between major gift programs that were seeing success, we found a couple of things. One, 92% of the successful organizations with major gifts have a development plan that focuses on raising major gifts, and that this development plan is woven throughout their strategic plan, and they are leveraging the work that they are doing all year long, and major gifts is part of that plan. It's not a standalone piece of it. And this is even true for organizations that don't have any full-time major gift fundraisers. We also found that really sort of wonderful construct of a campaign was a strong indicator for successful major gift fundraising. And there's several reasons for that, but the main reason is that the entire organization is focused on that concept of major gifts, is focused on donor engagement, and is focused on stewardship when you're in a campaign. We also heard that 90% of the organizations that we surveyed, that the board of directors are involved in gift cultivation and solicitation. Now, this was a self-reporting survey, and we'll come back to this in a little bit, but I am a tiny bit suspect of that level because one of the things that I hear when I'm talking to organizations and their fundraising is the struggle to get board members to actually truly follow through on their commitments for major gift fundraising. So I'm not sure that I completely believe that statistic. We also found that 96% of the organizations we surveyed, that the head of the organization is involved in major gift fundraising, and we think this is really important for organizations that are successful. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the head of the organization is managing its own giant portfolio, but it does mean that they're staffed, that they're participating in relationship development, and that they're keeping the organization focused on that concept of major gifts. If we take a look at the structure of successful fundraising strategy, there are these 4 key ingredients that wrap around the context of your organization. And these are the ones that we've been just talking about now. This concept of staffing and systems that are metric-driven and focused on major gifts, leadership that's participating in the major gift process and is helping build the donor relations, strong opportunities for donor engagement that's consistent and is at a high touch and a low touch. And then also very important to have a case for support where your fundraisers know exactly what they're fundraising for, and it's a case that views your organization from an external perspective. Why does somebody from the outside of your organization care enough to invest at a significant level? I'm going to hand it over to Dan to give us our key takeaways.
So the really good news is that major gifts are increasing in California, and this includes the gifts at the $1 million level and greater. So may not be as great news for Northern California, but it is actually good news for Southern California, which has seen a loss. In making major gifts an organization-wide priority in your strategic development plan, and not only that, I would emphasize in your strategic plan for the organization, if possible, is a way that you can ensure that you're including board, CEO, and staff, and then you can further invest and increase your staffing and appropriately address the resources you need for your systems. And data management is critical. Track and manage donor relationships in your database with key metrics for measuring that success. And in this case, less is more. When we've talked to leaders who are involved in major gifts and find them to be successful, we found that they actually pretty much choose 3 to 5 metrics, which they talk to with their major gift officers, and they decide on those key metrics about what they're going to be measuring for success. That's critical. We didn't have time to talk about this during this conversation, but we look to explore this further. Also, that to really strive to maintain balanced portfolios to ensure intentional cultivation of stewardship. And in this case, as Cassie was talking about, what we've discovered is that one size does not fit all. So there might be a best practice of having 125 donors and prospects in a portfolio, or a range between 100 and 200, but that may not be the right portfolio for the leader, or it may not be the right portfolio for the donors themselves, and they may need more attention. So again, one size does not fit all. And then really critically use the case of support that really tailors stories to fit donors' priorities and interests. And it's the message that is going to make the difference, or in a way, make or break the success of any major giving program.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate the takeaways. So now we would like to invite our panelists to share their experiences related to major gifts, what has worked for them, and how this data resonates with them. So I'd like to start with the first question with Chris. How do your personal experiences match up with the data that we're seeing in this study?
Yeah, we are definitely seeing a lot of what you're talking about. Most of our major donors are individuals. We do have some foundation and some corporate giving, but we are very reliant on individual donors. And when I started a few years ago, what we've seen is a shift in the number of major donors that we're getting, that we've been getting over time. Because when I started at the Performing Arts Center about 4 years ago, and we had about 90% of the dollars we raised came from around 10% of our donors. So we were very heavily reliant on a small number of people. And now that has shifted to about 75-25, which is, in my opinion, a safer number. We're trying to broaden our base of major donors. And but for us, it's definitely individuals. We have a small shop, like I said before. I do not have a major gift officer. It's just me, and we have a development officer who's focused on a lot of different things. And in addition to development, I also oversee our marketing department. So I have to divide my time between that as well. So, finding the time to focus on major gifts is somewhat of a challenge, but for us, it's a real priority. But we've definitely seen an uptick in the number of donors who are coming out at the higher levels, which has been a real positive for us.
That is a positive. That's terrific. And finding that balance between everything that you have to do in a small shop, and then carving out the dedicated time to focus on major gifts is really tough. We'd love to hear from Laura about your personal experiences, and how does this relate to the data that we're sharing in this study?
So, like Dan, the center also is a small shop, and when I first started at the center almost 5 years ago, I was, like Dan too, doing the same work. Just kind of, my time was spent on a lot of different aspects of the advancement program, and unable to focus solely my attention on these major gift prospects and program. And we definitely saw that we were not getting the amount of gifts in at the rate in which we wanted to receive them, because we didn't have time to dedicate. Through the last 4 years, we were able to, through strategic planning and really being intentional about what it was that we wanted to achieve in terms of dollars in and dollars raised, we decided that we needed to hire a major gift officer. And I can tell you, your statistics are truly on point. I think because of our focus on the major gifts program, we did see a huge uptick on our gifts coming in. And I'd also tell you that, while we look at our trustees to step in and help us, they are vital to what we do. They're volunteers, but I would tell you that we have to be sensitive to their time, and they often tell us what they're able to do in terms of the cultivation process or the solicitation process or the stewardship process. And I think that it's, again, going back to listening to how you can utilize those efforts that they can put forth and help you. I think they're a great addition, but I don't necessarily, I'm with you, don't necessarily know that the percentage is that high of involvement. I would say ours is a little bit lower, but they're still incredibly helpful and active.
That's great. That's good to hear. Dan, your question. Did we lose Dan?
Sorry about that. Laura, I actually wanted to ask you a follow-up question for what you just said, because I know a campaign is a great motivator for people and for the organization to raise a lot of big gifts. But where does major gifts fit in terms of priority for your organization? And who is involved in the major gift work, and what are their other responsibilities?
Well, for us, I think that the Major Gifts program is essential, especially when you're trying to run a large campaign raising an incredible amount of money. You have to be intentional about how you are moving your donors and getting those solicitations in, and also being mindful of, again, I'll just reiterate this, but cultivation and stewardship are so critical beyond receiving the gifts. And we were intentional by getting our major gifts officer. I spend about 75% of my time, in addition to the major gifts officer, to these donors and a portfolio in addition. And our head of school spends about 50% of his time as well with major gifts. So we are really I think it's critical. In addition to managing those portfolios, I would say he has about 50 donors in his portfolio. Our major gifts officer has between 150 to 200, and I have around 100 and 150. But my major gifts officer and I often are speaking on a daily basis, and depending on our engagement with individuals in those portfolios, we may interchange some of those donors, which is always really nice. But if she's speaking with one of my donors because she's seen them on the campus and has struck up a lovely engagement with them and has formed a relationship with them, oftentimes I will have her take the lead on that individual, and vice versa with her. I spend 75%, as I said, 75% of my time managing the major donor program alongside the major gifts officer. The other 20% of my time is spent, with program oversight and events and annual fundraising beyond the capital campaign. I would say that my major gifts officer spends her time really working closely with building out our database to make sure that we get our statistics as accurate as we can, building out our stewardship and our cultivation and tracking system in addition to the research. She also does grant writing and reporting. So that falls under her wheelhouse. So it's a major focus and push on the capital campaign.
Thank you, Laura. That's very, very interesting. I think it's very interesting about trading or the sharing of prospects and portfolios. We're starting to see more of that in organizations, and it gives you some extra work around managing air traffic control, but I think it's an interesting strategy. Chris, I wanted to jump to a question around the barriers to successful major gift work. And thinking about your practice and all that's on your plate, if you could change one thing to improve your success with major gifts, if you could make a wish on it, what would you do at the Livermore Valley Performing Arts Center or someplace that you've been in the past?
Well, aside from hiring a whole bunch of major gift officers, what I would probably do, well, we have a lot of barriers, and it's not just time. We're in a competitive environment. There's a lot of other arts organizations in the area, and we have some great philanthropic people in our community, and they're kind of dividing their attention. So that's a really kind of a challenge for us. And another challenge, I think, for major gift fundraising is oftentimes just getting access and connecting with the right people, and kind of making sure you're going around in the same circles so you find these individuals who can support you. That's a big issue too. And I think sometimes too a barrier, and this is just kind of a cultural thing. I think for us, when I started, there was this misperception of what a major donor looked like, and not really understanding what, you didn't have to be a CEO or own your own private jet to be a major donor. There's a lot of different faces of major donors, and we really needed to develop a culture of philanthropy within our whole organization. So everybody, from our facilities to our box office person to our ushers, they all knew and understood the importance of some of these donors and the gifts that they could potentially make. And it's, thinking about whoever you talk to, it is a potential major donor. And so kind of changing what the face of a donor looks like is sometimes, I think, a challenge. But for me in particular, I really would love to see, we have a great board, and they do help, they give a lot. It is definitely a challenge to get them to help us in the asking, but they're coming along pretty well. If I did have more time to commit to major gifts, I definitely would focus on it. So I think running a small shop, you really do have to be thoughtful about how you spend your time. And I also think about too, if 80% of your dollars that you're raising are coming from 20% of your donors, then you might want to think about investing 80% of your time and resources into those 20%. And I think sometimes we get caught up in some work that is not as high of a return, although it could be equally important. And so, time management is always a big barrier. So somebody that can really help us with that, I think, would be a big boost.
The time management piece around major gifts is really challenging. I agree. And I think it's also super interesting what you're saying about identifying a major gift prospect and what that person looks like, and that whole concept of qualification. Dan, question from you.
Yeah, and I would just say that and add that when we talked to an audience of California fundraisers, that over like 50% of the audience responded that they had challenges with that time management piece. So I think that's an important factor of just being the head of development. One of the most interesting things that I always enjoy is understanding staffing and systems and the metrics behind that. And I want to start with Laura first, but I wanted to hear from you, Chris, as well. But what is your philosophy around metrics, Laura?
Well, I think metrics are really vital. I would, in full disclosure and transparency, I am relational based, and my weakness is data. However, we in my office have tried really hard to and intentionally to build out our data management system to help us do the work. And meaning that I feel that it's really important, and it's helped us reporting to the board and meeting our own goals in fundraising, is to make sure that we are really building out our portfolios and using the tracking system from the time that we have touch points with our first prospect until we get the donation, and then we steward them. And we're in the middle of our campaign right now where we've been doing this for a while, and now we're going back to some of our major donors asking for a second gift. And I think that whole cycle is so critical to just really be diligent about documenting the actual what your research is showing you should be asking versus what your intel is telling you, and then finally concluding what kind of an ask you're going to make to that donor. And interestingly enough, what we're finding is when you have a certain number that you're about to ask your major donor in the solicitation could very well change within the room depending on that conversation and that situation. And we're finding that we get about 72% of our asked gifts that actually come in at that same ask. So there is, obviously a variation that comes in that we didn't determine. It's not typical to get to make an ask and get more than what you're asking. We have had that happen occasionally, but oftentimes we're seeing 72% of our donors are giving at the level in which we've asked, and then we have those occasions where we are getting a little less than what we are asking. So I think those are great numbers to be watching and tracking, and it's wonderful to be able to use those metrics for the board because they're always asking those questions. They want to know how we're spending our time so that they can feel like when you're hiring a major gifts officer that dedicated and intentional position is actually worth what we're doing in the office. And I can tell you that I think hands down it is so beneficial to have someone dedicated because we're seeing the results.
And that's interesting because, Laura, you're very data-driven as your approach to fundraising, and that's the science. That's the science piece of it. But the art of fundraising, when you have to go to the ask, you have to be able to be flexible. Clearly, you have to be able to. You may have a number, but it may not be the right one. Chris, what's your philosophy around metrics when you're with your work at Livermore Valley Performing Arts Center?
Well, I was really fortunate. So before I was at the Performing Arts Center, I worked in a university at St. Mary's College of California, and I learned a lot there. And they did a really good job of emphasizing metrics and the database and how to use the database and thinking about tools like wealth screening and data analytics and really using the data to your advantage to help you narrow down, especially if you struggle with your time and allocating your time. Data metrics really helps you narrow things down. And I'll tell you one quick story. We a couple years ago when I first started at the Performing Arts Center, we had never done a wealth screen, and we went through that process, and we took some of those points. And then we took giving history of donors. And for us, the $1,000 threshold is kind of like our threshold that kind of puts you over into the major giving level. And we don't really have a lot of time to go around asking people for that amount. I usually spend time going for the larger numbers. And so one of the things we did is we took the data and pulled a list of about 100 people that were donors at the lower levels, and we called this our upgrade mailing, and we just sent them a very highly personalized letter asking if they would consider upgrading to that level. And the executive director and I split the letters, and we wrote notes on every single one, and it was just but these were very highly qualified prospects that would use the data. So we sent that out, 100 letters, and that first year we did it, I think we got about 13 to 15 back at the $1,000 level. So, a mailing like that had a 15% return was very significant for us, and it was it was a good way to kind of move people up to that pipeline without and saving some time in the process. So I think it's really critical, and I definitely learned a lot. And the other thing to think about with the data is, even though the wealth screening tools are really good, especially in California, you have to consider that sometimes people have assets that are, they might be asset rich but cash poor. So you have to look at, the house that maybe they've lived in for a long time. And you still need to get to know the person and spend time with them and before 100% trusting the data. So, because sometimes it's not accurate. So I think there is a science and there is an art to coming in and knowing what the right amount to ask is.
Thank you, Chris. That's a great response. So we've got about 10 minutes left in our webinar, and I was wondering if I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience.
Sure. We do have a question regarding pipeline building and sort of if any trends were identified or regarding mid-level giving and looking at that. So in terms of building the pipeline.
Absolutely. I'll start and invite our panelists to fill in. The example that Chris just gave around upgrading donors who have been annual donors but have the capacity to be giving more is a really great story around pipeline building. Where I've seen through my work at Campbell Company, organizations seeing a lot of success is thinking about how you transition those annual donors who are giving, and in some cases they are giving for transactional reasons. They're getting a membership, they're getting some benefits or perks from giving to your organization, and how do you move those people into more giving from a philanthropic basis, an inspirational basis. And that's where you really start to see the success in the pipeline building is dealing or interacting with them, engaging them in ways where they feel like they're a part of the success of the organization, and you are moving them from this annual transactional piece to this relationship piece. It's probably one of the more important areas where you can focus, and part of that should be based on what both Laura and Chris were talking about, of knowing the potential capacity of your donors and who's worth investing, the people who have the ability to give and are giving at a much lower level than their ability. Laura, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I'll give you a perfect example. Last night we had a cultivation dinner. It was a small, intimate evening with about 9 couples that we identified as major gift prospects. And we really looked very closely. They were new families. We were looking closely at their annual giving over the last 2 years and saw a significant increase. And we felt that they were becoming more engaged with the institution based on their annual gift. And that, for us, was a way to track whether or not we should put the time and energy into potentially moving them through the pipeline and beginning to engage with them on a deeper level. And the dinner was a perfect opportunity to do that. We sent out 9 invitations and got 9 responses from these couples who showed up and were thrilled to be a part of the institution. And it was an evening not of an ask, of course, or even talking about money, but it was an evening where we spoke about the community and what it meant to be part of the community. We were able to talk about the initiatives of the institution. I think it's really important when you have your leaders of the institution in the room, your major gift officer in the room, your trustees, those leaders who are helping you engage and cultivate these major gift prospects to really know your case for support and really understand how to passionately share the story. And it's really a compelling ability to be in that room and first of all be part of it, but also take a step back and look at what's developing in the room. When we had a wonderful opportunity this morning to be able to group together and have a discussion, a follow-up discussion about the evening and what our next steps are, and for each of those couples. And I think that's really important too, and it's all part of the tracking and moving these constituents through the pipeline to get them to where you want them to be, which is in a solicitation and partnering with the institution at a level that you not only know they're capable of, but also have the propensity or the inclination to gift at that level. So that's, to me, I feel like that's where the fun part starts, is how to develop these folks that are engaged and want to be more engaged and identifying them.
That's the fun part, and that's also the critical part where I see so many organizations leaving money on the table, so to speak, is at following a great dinner like the one you just described, of not knowing then what those next steps are and not having a plan to roll out for further cultivation. So that's a great story. I think we have time for one more question. Do we have another question from the audience?
We sure do. The question is, I am desperate to develop a culture of philanthropy, not only in the development shop, but throughout the organization. Has anyone done this or have some insight into making that happen?
That's a really great question, and I think probably one of the most important things you can do towards building a major gift program. I tend to think of a culture of philanthropy as building a culture of community, and it's not so much that everybody in the organization is going to be asking for money, but more that everybody can speak easily, passionately, and in an articulate way about the value of the organization, why they're a part of the organization, and what the priorities are of the organization, so that everybody from the person who is greeting you when you first come in to perhaps somebody in the cafeteria, all the way up to the board and the CEO, have the same but personalized messaging about the value of the organization. Chris, do you have any examples or stories of building a culture of philanthropy?
Yeah, so one thing I do, we work on training our boards. I do have a program annually where we do development training for the board and also with the staff. And what we talk about is, our organization has two missions. One mission is to serve the community through the arts, and the other mission is to raise money. And they're equally important because we can't do the first without the second. And that's just, they're held in the same regard as how we talk about it, but it really has to come from leadership down. And the other thing we try and do is we have 100% giving on our board and 100% giving on our staff. And we don't really talk about dollars with the staff, how much you give, but just the importance of making a gift. And when people do that, it really helps. If you're invested in the organization, not only you're working there, but you're also invested in it in a different way, I think really helps to advance that. But the idea that it's you really have two missions, and that second mission is very critical for the survival of the first mission, and getting the leadership to really understand that and to participate in that, I think is really important. So that's usually how we talk about it. Other things we do is on our database system, we have flags for major donors and prospects. And so if you're in our box office and you're selling a ticket and they give you their name, you can see right away that this is a major donor prospect. You can see it if you're an usher and they get they scan someone's ticket, they know. We try and make it very evident who there is a prospect for us. And the other thing is we're pretty lucky in that as an organization, our donors come to us because we have a theater, so we see them a lot, we see their faces, we get to know them really well, and we share stories of the donors with the rest of the staff pretty frequently. And I think that really helps advance that culture.
Thank you, Chris. It's that building of authentic relationships that's so critical. Well, it looks like we are out of time for the webinar today. I want to, on behalf of Dan, I'd like to thank both of our panelists, Chris and Laura. We greatly appreciate your participation and conversation. And I want to thank all of our attendees and participants in the audience. Major gifts is a fun, challenging topic, and I think our next steps at Campbell Company is to dig in a little bit deeper so that we're understanding more around the portfolios and the metrics, and your suggestions are welcome to us.
Thank you, everyone. appreciate you being part of this this conversation on major gifts. And if you want to look and download a company copy of our report, here's the information you need. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact any one of us. We'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.